And we'll make a start. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the General Federation of Trade Unions Educational Trust Trade Union and Working Class History Series in partnership with Marx Memorial Library down in London and the Working Class Movement Library. My name is Nathan and I'm the Engagement and Events Coordinator at the Working Class Movement Library. The WCML is an independent library and archive. We care for and give access to our library and archive collection that covers over 200 years of working class history. We offer tours, events, and exhibitions and continue to develop our collection. The event this evening will work, well, as it's a Zoom webinar, that means that you can see us, but we can't see you. You can't see each other. So feel free to use the chat throughout the call, but to ask questions, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I will then ask your questions directly to Wilf at the end of his presentation. Tonight is the 10th session in this year's program, and the topic of discussion will be Imperial Typewriters with Wilf Sullivan. We have a maximum of about 45 minutes for Wilf's presentation, and that will be followed by around roughly 45 minutes of your questions, answers, and comments. So we're aiming to finish about 8:30 so we can hopefully enjoy a bit of the sunshine before bedtime. Just to remind you that during the call, we'll be following the GFTU Educational Trust Behaviour Statement. I'll share the link I'll share the link of that to the chat when I'm done with the introduction. And now to introduce Wilf Sullivan. So Wilf worked as the Race Equality Officer for the TUC from December 2004 until his retirement in 2023. He worked in local government for 10 years with young people in the residential care sector and with young people involved in the criminal justice system before subsequently working as a principal personnel officer, dealing with information technology, recruitment, and monitoring equal opportunities. He was appointed by NALGO, which I'm sure you'll know is now Unison, as a regional full-time officer in 1990 and worked for 10 years organising, representing and negotiating for members in health, local government, higher education, housing and private sector organisations. He worked as Unison's National Black Members Officer from 2000 before moving to the TUC as the Race Equality Policy Officer. He is still active in race equality, migration and asylum campaigns, and is a trustee for Migrant Voice, Care for Calais, and War and Want. He also carries out trade union liaison role for Stand Up to Racism. Wilf is passionate about the need to document the involvement of Black workers in the trade union movement and has established the Black Trade Union Oral History Project with the TUC Library and London Metropolitan University. So that's it from me. So Wilf, take it when you're ready.
Okay, thanks very much, Nathan, and good evening to everybody. I've been asked to talk a bit about the Imperial Typewriters strike, but I wanted to just start by talking a little bit about what was going on at the time, because it was the beginning of the post-war bust, really, and the 1970s saw an economic depression that went on from about 73 to about 79. Back in the annals of history, obviously in 73, Ted Heath had introduced a 3-day week and made a famous statement about who runs the country, him or the unions, and called an election in 74, which Labour won with a minority government, and then later on in the year, in October, Labour won a narrow election by about 3 seats. But I mean, the context of all that, of that, irrespective of government, was public spending cuts, attempts at freezing wages, and generally a downward pressure on the cost of living because of rising inflation. You know, as far as the different Black communities went, they had been living in a context where anti-immigration sentiment was rising, especially after the 68 Commonwealth Act, which, despite the advice to the then Labour government that it was racist in what it was trying to do because it was aimed at East African Asians who were being who were fleeing from Africa. That act was passed and was followed rapidly by one in 1971, which closed the door even further. And against that backdrop, what you saw was the rise of the National Front. Off the back of an anti-immigration sentiment, really. And in Leicester, at the time, in 74, the NF got 9,000 votes. And the front page headlines were referring to floods and invasions of Asian immigrants to Leicester. And Leicester City Council actually took out a full-page advert in the Ugandan Argus newspaper, urging Ugandans who were fleeing Uganda not to come to Leicester. So, you know, what you had was a toxic mixture of moral panic from politicians and the press, which allowed the National Front and other racists to make inroads into Leicester. So Imperial Typewriters, I mean, I think was not one of wasn't what it's important not to look at it as a dispute on its own. It was one of a series of disputes that have been going on in Black and Asian workplaces since actually the mid 60s, where the first big strike at Red Scar Mills took place. But there have been a number since then, and Imperial Typewriters became famous partly because the national profile it got, because of the lively picket lines, because of the fact that its picket lines were getting attacked by National Front activists. And because the workers were very strident in trying to gain public support. Just to say a little bit about Imperial Typewriters, it was bought by an American firm called Litton's in 1968. And they were the second biggest firm in the world at that time, producing typewriters and other sorts of printing equipment. And one of the things they did was focus on recruiting migrant Asian workers. And of the 1,600 workers employed in the Leicester factory, 1,100 were from Asia, mainly East African Asians. And I mean, they did this not out of their kindness of their hearts because they wanted to give black workers jobs, but because actually they saw them, there's a way of reducing their labour costs and exploiting workers. And indeed, between 68 and 74, the productivity of these workers was such that turnover trebled. But despite that, as we all know with the bosses, they don't give away anything. Bonus levels were being negotiated downwards to increase profits. And more Asian women who were seen as passive were employed to reduce labour costs. So that is sort of the background to it. And I mean, I think that point about Asian women who were seen as passive came back to really bite them in the dispute, actually, because the grievance that initially set off the strike was when an Asian woman was accidentally given a white woman's pay slip and discovered that the Asian women were being paid less. Especially around bonus levels, where they were expected to produce much more to get a bonus than the white workers in the factory. And so on May Day of that year in 74, with workers from 4 other companies as part of the May Day protests walked out. And 39 of these Asian women walked out along with the workers from the other factories. The workers of the other factories went back after May Day, but they didn't. They stayed out and started trying to build support within the factory from other workers to join the strike. One of the things that they did was demand their own shop stewards. When they discovered that Reg Weaver, the factory convened through who was then the factory convener, that bonus targets were higher for all Asian workers than the white workers. And so it immediately created a problem of trust between the workers and the union officials at the time. And in the first couple of days, between 50 and sometimes up to 200 workers manned a picket line that they had immediately set up. By the third day, the company had enough and threatened to sack the original 39 people that had gone on strike. And obviously, we're looking to try and get other people from out in the community to persuade the workers to go back to work. A guy called Tom Bradley, who was the local MP and president of the TSSA, tried to get them to return to work by telling them that they needed to adopt proper procedure. And Reg Weaver, the convener, also tried to get them to return to work. And this obsession about whether or not people were following the proper procedures in terms of taking industrial action had been a feature in other disputes involving Black and Asian workers, where unions either didn't support the struggles or only partially supported the struggles in a way that was not going to help workers succeed. But I mean, despite those attempts to get the workers to go back to work, by the end of the first week of the strike, the 39 had grown to about from 39 to about 500 to 600 workers. By the 9th, the company decided that they were going to try and frighten the workers back to work and sack 75 of the strikers. And in those days, you instead of being sent your P45, you were sent your cards, as it was called. And the workers, well, as far as the convener was concerned, rather cheekily sent their cards back to the company, and basically sending a message that they weren't going away. They might have been sacked, but the strike continued. Another complication was that the local convener, Reg Weaver, and the district official, George Bromley, didn't recognise the elected leaders that had been elected by the workers and tried to undermine the strike. In fact, Bromley found a ancient rule within the T&G rule book, which Jack Jones later said, well, actually repudiated, didn't really apply in this situation, that you had to be a member of the T&G for 2 years before you could be elected as a steward. So what then happened was a bit of a standoff, because Bromley wouldn't talk to the local, to the elected stewards that the workers had elected to be part of the leadership for the strike. And the company wouldn't talk to the stewards because they didn't want to offend the union, so they'd only talk to Bromley. So there was a bit of a sort of standoff, really. I mean, in the meantime, despite the lack of union support, and Bromley took the view and actually went on radio to say that the workers hadn't followed proper procedures, and he looked at the situation, and as far as he concerned, they had no legitimate grievances. And then he tried to claim that, part of the reason for this dispute was racial tensions between Africans and Asian workers in the factory, which was a bit of which, given the level of anti-immigration and feeling out in the community, was a really sort of spurious claim, really. I mean, and he also was an anti-communist, and he believed that the workers wanted to take over the union machinery, and that they were backed by communist money, and made several comments in newspapers about, oh, he'd seen people on picket lines being given £5 notes to try and back this up. I mean, completely nuts, of course. But in a situation and an atmosphere where employers were trying to use fear, the fear of unemployment against workers, it was a real dereliction of duty that union officials who ended up siding with the employers. From their point of view, it was, we need to keep the employers on side to keep the company going. The workers didn't take it lying down and continued lobbying for the strike to be made official, and worked with the Indian Workers Association, and went down to lobby at Transport House at the time to get the union to make the dispute official. I mean, in the end, Jack Jones agreed to have an inquiry into why the dispute wasn't made official, but didn't actually overrule the local officials down there so that the full support of the union could be brought to bear in this dispute. I think that didn't help later at the end of this dispute. The workers also asked the Race Relations Board, which was the precursor to the Commission for Race Equality, to come down and investigate. But after some not very supportive remarks made by the chair of the Relations Board at the time, they refused to cooperate with the board's investigations, and wrote to the board saying, well, given the lack of trust, that the board shouldn't come down. But the board continued to do its investigation and only talk to the management, and came out with a report which basically said they found no discrimination at all in terms of the way that pay was organised and the bonuses were paid, which in some ways vindicated why the workers had sort of boycotted the board in the first place. I think one of the most important things about this dispute was, and the way it was sustained, was actually the community support it got. And that growth in community support in terms of a number of disputes that had happened since 65 really had been the thing that had sustained a lot of these disputes. But there was tremendous community support in Leicester, with the local Sikh temples providing food, community leaders visiting strikers on a daily basis to make sure that they were okay. 4 of the factories with large Asian workforces aided with donations to the strike fund and pledged for a 24-hour stoppage in support if the strike committee saw that was appropriate. And support came from across the local community and black organisations across the country. And one of the things that really got the police worried, because the picket lines were getting bigger, and were being policed, partly because they were so big, partly because of the violence that came from National Front attacking the picket line. Although the police didn't arrest the National Front, they arrested some of the workers instead. But one of the things that worried the police was that the Asian youth organisations in Leicester became very involved in helping to support the picket lines. And it became an important part of that local and community support for the dispute. Now, I mean, the dispute sort of dragged on for about 14 weeks. And in the end, the union agreed to include the Leaders of Strike Committee in the talks, and after 14 weeks, a deal to return to work was made. But the fact was that 3 months later, Litton's closed the factory down. And so, I mean, I think and so that's the way, in some ways, the strike ended. The fact that the union hadn't fully supported it, the fact that they hadn't built unity between all the workers in the factory, and the fact that they hadn't actually fought for a fair deal for workers, and to make sure that the business in Leicester was modernised, because it had extremely old equipment, and its profit model was by exploiting the workers for productivity rather than invested in the factory. It meant that the whole workforce ended up losing their jobs. But one of the things I think was really important about what happened is contained in the statement that the strike committee made at the end of the strike. And they wrote that our struggle has taught us also that black workers must never for a moment entertain the thought of separate black unions. They must join the existing unions and fight through them. Where the unions fail in their duties to black workers, they must be challenged to stand up for their rights. The union is an organisation of all workers, regardless of race, colour or sex. Right now, the trade union movement in Britain is functioning as a white man's union, and this must be challenged. In challenging this, we believe in the unity of the working class. This unity must be solidly established in deed and not in words. It is the main task of the trade union movement to create this unity. I think, for me, that statement reflects a lot of encapsulate what a lot of black activists across the movement felt at the time. And this strike, by the way, inspired a number of other strikes that year across the country. And what you saw was many of the activists that were involved have been involved in strikes before, going and giving advice and support to workers in other struggles. But nevertheless, the problem of actually getting proper union support continued until, really, I think, the Grunwicks dispute, which I know is the subject of your next session, really. But I think there's some lessons that we have to learn from all these histories. And for me, it's not just a matter of saying, well, this was this was really important dispute, and in history. One thing we're very good at doing in the British trade union movement, I think, is celebrating our glorious defeats, and not really learning some of the lessons from it. And in many ways, what Imperial Typewriters was, and Litton's was an example of, was how a multinational corporate infrastructure was being used as a meeting point for cheap labour in terms of hiring mainly Asian workers, because before 1968, Litton's factory hadn't employed any black workers at all. So Lytton, when they took over Express, this was expressly part of their operation and part of their employment model. Uh, um, so, and we see that today in a big way with firms like Amazon and Uber, and how they use migrant labour as a cheap as a source of cheap labour to to maximise their profits. Secondly, was how the union failed to organise the workers, really to build power and develop a strategy to secure stable employment and decent wages. And I think that's still a problem that we've got in the movement today. Lots of people used to ask me questions about, well, how do we increase the numbers of black workers in trade unions? And I often used to say, well, maybe we need to go and organise where they're working. And I think one of the things that is a huge problem today is that use of cheap labour by multinational corporations, and how actually identity in the private sector is so so low as a mainstream trade union movement, that actually we are not in a position to make a real difference in terms of the economic prospects for people's lives. And it's one of the reasons I think what you see is a lot of smaller unions, which are migrant unions in a way, are springing up again. And I say that again because often people refer to some of these unions as if they're a new thing, but actually there was a pattern of workers' associations. One of the biggest ones being the Indian Workers Association, obviously that started in the 1930s, that was really key in helping to organise Asian workers into some of the big unions at the time, but was also very critical of those unions in terms of not supporting some of the struggles that those workers were facing. And so, for me, one of the consequences of not learning those lessons, where actually I think unions end up concentrating and still end up concentrating on places where they've got good recognition, where there's established collective bargaining machinery, where there's relatively good terms and conditions. And I'm not saying for a moment that those workers don't need to be supported, but that actually what you get is almost like a privileged core and a very vulnerable outer periphery, where what we've seen is a huge growth of in-work poverty. For example, more than 20% of the UK workforce are paid below the living wage, and for black workers, they're 50% more likely to be paid below the living wage than white workers. And part of that undoubtedly is because they're not in areas that are unionised, and where they are unionised, they're often part of a labour supply chain in outsourced companies in areas like cleaning and catering, where even if there is union recognition, actually they're not organised in such a way as to really put pressure on the employers to improve their terms and conditions. So I think for me, Imperial Typewriters was really important because actually it highlighted the ways that people could organise to other black workers. I mean, obviously, it shone a light on what was going on, but it also inspired the movement for black self-organisation within trade unions, which I think has been one of the key things that has changed union attitudes to how they deal with black workers and what they need to do to fight for race equality in the labour market and continue to need to improve the ways they do that. So I'm going to stop there because I've talked for half an hour. I could talk for an hour, but I'm not going to because it's boring. And and let's really try and get discussion going. I noticed that people were talking about the exhibition, and I talked to people who at the university were doing the exhibition, and they've still got a bit of a website up with some of the testimonies from the workers at Imperial Typewriters. So it's worth going to have a look at.